Good morning, Electric Culture of Safety Line Team. Welcome aboard. We have a special guest, Miss Pamela Tompkins with Set Solutions. And I was going through all the episodes. Miss Pam will be talking to you about the two-person rule, the OSHA two-person rule, which I've never heard before. So I'm extremely interested in hearing this from her and her shares. And I went back and did a little study, and after 81 episodes, which she's going to be providing here today, number 81, Set Solutions have given back to our line team around the country, nationwide, about 10%, about 8 or 9 or so episodes on their own, so about 10% have come from Mr. Matt Edmonds, Miss Pamela Tompkins themselves, and we just thank them so much for giving back to the industry and sharing with our folks. And just a real quick note, we are making the Lineman Safety National Webinars, we are making them public. All you have to do is go to electriccultureofsafety.com and click onto the resource button. Click on the resources, and when you get to the full length, pick your topic and click onto it. It'll take you to the full-length webinar right away. They should be all public in a week or so. It's October 2025, so just get ready to click in on those and use them for your team back at home. And we just want to thank you, Pam, for everything you give and do with Set Solutions for our community, our lineman community, and what you all share is amazing. Like Mr. Matt Edmonds, he's always busy, you're always busy. So what do you all kind of not sharing as far as the who, but kind of what are you guys doing lately?
Lots. We've got a lot going on right now. We are working with several different companies trying to help them with their safe work practices right now. Matt's on the road like training all over the place. We've got other folks that have been working down in Texas doing some work with some solar farms. We do some of that work. We've got some folks that are doing some human performance things. So we've got a lot of stuff going on in the company right now.
Very good. So let's get with it then, Miss Pam, and your two-person rule. I want to hear this.
Well,
I'm excited.
I'm excited too. I'm excited too. This is a program that's really near and dear to my heart. I say that every single time I come here and provide a presentation. But this two-person rule, what I'm hoping today to do is this. I brought some objectives to the table for you. I want to really start out talking about the primary purpose of the two-person rule. A lot of times I find in the industry that folks don't understand that, so I'm going to really break that down for you today. I'm also going to talk about like how this two-person rule kind of supports electric safe work practices. It's going to be incorporated in the purpose as I talk through that. And then hopefully you're going to be able to walk away today understanding and knowing when two people are required on electric power job sites. Now, I've got a disclaimer, and I'm sure that you're going to probably see this on the screen, but I want to talk through this disclaimer. I'm going to be talking about the OSHA rule. I'm going to give you insight into that. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that the industry does as a whole to actually make this two-person rule work. In your company, you may have a two-person rule that looks a little different than what I'm going to be going over. If you do, then certainly you may want to talk with some of your leadership just to talk about some of the bare bone basics we're going to talk about. But certainly ensure that you're staying true to your two-person rule within your utility at the end of the day, okay? So let's just start with the OSHA side of it. You know, OSHA back in the early 90s basically said, you know, on electric power work sites, transmission and distribution, we're going to have a requirement sometimes when two people are going to be required on that job site. You're going to find it in the OSHA standards, in the general industry standard, and you're going to find it in the construction standard, in the general industry standard and the construction standard. It's not going to be called a two-person rule. It's going to be called at least 2 employees. Now, you're going to find it in general industry under L2. L is the large encompassing area in the OSHA standard that talks about working on or near energized electric power facilities. You find it very high on that list. So OSHA has a very strong intent of having 2 people on job sites in particular job tasking. So let's kind of set the stage for what that looks like. I've got a slide here that's going to say, and this is what the OSHA rule is. We're going to tie it down like all the requirements for it here in a minute. But the major thing that OSHA has is at least 2 employees shall be present when, and keep in mind, I'm going to talk about when here in just a few minutes, tasked expose employees to greater than 600 volts. Now, I'm going to just say that I think this is a minimum requirement. Folks all the time say, well, why was it 600 volts? OSHA has some language around why, but at the end of the day, I can't give you a firm answer as to why it was chosen. Because we know that there are electric power work practices that are being done that has very high risk associated with the hazards associated with it at a lot lower voltages than this. But as far as the OSHA rule is, it applies at greater than 600 volts. So let's start with that. Now, I love to give stories of things that have happened in our industry to connect the dots here. So several years ago, a smaller utility, and those of you that are online that might be from a large utility, this might not even seem like it's a real scenario, but it's definitely real. In the small utility world, a lot of times small utilities don't have system operators or controllers at nighttime operations. So they use phone services. So if there's an outage, someone calls in, they say, okay, and dispatch the person that is actually on call. In this particular situation, that's exactly what happened. You know, a customer lost power, they call into this telephone service. The telephone services then calls the person on standby and dispatches them over to the location. So this is what happened. This happened in the middle of the night. So the next morning, the crew that normally drives the truck that the gentleman was driving for standby operations tried to find their truck. The truck was not to be found. Folks said, well, this gentleman was on standby last night. He must still be out with the truck. Nobody could tie down anything, so they called the answering service to try to figure out where he was dispatched. They then went to that location and found the gentleman at the bottom of the pole, and he lost his life. He was dead. So the two-person rule, to me, has a lot of strength. When we talk about it, there's so many other things. I'm going to share some other, or at least one other incident that occurred a little later on. But that really sets the stage. When folks go out to perform work, there's so many hazards. There's so many things that 2 people need to be there to be able to successfully complete these jobs. So let's talk about the purpose. I want to start by setting the stage for the purpose of the two-person rule, and then we're going to talk about when OSHA says it applies. So let's start with this. The purpose. Now, you're going to see that I have under the list of the two-person rule, I have 3 main purposes. I start them from the top to the bottom. The top being the most important, down to the next, down to the next. So the first one is to prevent electrocution. I'm going to talk through what that looks like here. And I also want to talk about monitor work practices in just a few minutes, and then provide emergency response. Now, in our industry, when you ask people mostly about the two-person role, they're going to say, oh, it's to make sure somebody is on the job site to provide emergency response if something happens. I'm going to really, really hope that this presentation takes you out of that, gets you thinking well beyond emergency services. Now, honestly, if somebody needs emergency services, you've got to have somebody there. But let's start with the very first one here, prevent electrocution. So, OSHA stated back in the early 90s when the preamble first came out for the OSHA electric power standard that the primary purpose of the two-person rule was to prevent electrocution. All right. That means that that person is there to ensure that somebody does not get up into live energized parts, something does not occur. So we're being on the proactive side. A lot of times we think, hey, it's just reactive. If something happens, we got to have somebody there. I'm saying if something doesn't happen, we've got to have somebody there. We got to have somebody on the proactive side. Now, if the primary purpose is to prevent electrocution, it is so important to figure out, all right, well, how am I going to prevent electrocution if that second person is on site? I mean, what do they have to do? So honestly, that second person on site has to be qualified, and OSHA actually talked about this in several interpretations, and one I'm going to share with you toward the end of this presentation. They must be qualified and they must be capable of identifying the hazards, the things that are going on with the work process. So let's talk about this qualification thing, because a lot of times folks say, well, do they have to be qualified to the same level? Honestly, I leave that up to you, your company. But qualification has to hit a couple different things, and let's look at what they are. To be qualified under the OSHA rules, and I'm sure under your rules in your organization, whether you're a contractor or whether you are working in a utility, it has to meet the minimum requirements of what you're going to see on the screen here. A qualified employee has to be knowledgeable in the construction and operation. So there's two key things. If I have somebody that's a second person here, they're going to have to be knowledgeable in the construction and the operation of the equipment that the person that they are there to assist is performing. All right, so that's a key. Then that second person has to understand the job tasking that's being done, and they also have to understand what the associated hazards are. So that qualification for the person, that's the second person on that job site, they would need to have some skill set in this. They would need to know what the safety requirements are for it. And honestly, I would want to know ahead of time that they have demonstrated proficiency in this work tasking before I assign them as a second person on that job site. I wouldn't want to do it while they're on that job site. I would want to know ahead of time that they are qualified to actually be on that job site and to prevent electrocution. Now, I'm going to tie this into my next area, which is monitor work practices. If they're there to prevent electrocution, a piece of that is going to be to monitor those work practices. Now, this one is a major issue, and we see it whenever we're out performing field observations. The folks that work on our teams talk about this, the importance of it. I've seen it in the field. I know that it's happening. If you're there to monitor work practices, what do you have to do as the second person? It says here on the screen, you've got to focus your method on visually seeing it, visual awareness of the person that's working, and you've got to have a method of constant contact. So that doesn't mean that I've got two people on the job site. I've got one person over here performing tasks, and we're going to find out here in a few minutes. Those are tasks that are in that minimum approach distance, greater than 600 volts. So I've got folks over here performing this task, and then I've got my second person over doing something else that's not visually in touch with this person. They cannot contact them, and they're really not watching what's going on. So that's a very, very serious area, I think, that needs to be addressed. We need to look to see if there's any holes in our operations where this is occurring. That second person on that job site must be able to observe and work performed. So once again, they got to be there to observe it. They've got to be able to identify unsafe work methods. So if there's something somebody is performing, they've got to be able to say, hey, I'm going to stop this job, and I'm actually going to, we're going to talk about it, because when we gave the job briefing, it doesn't look like things are happening like it should be. That second person on the job site should feel empowerment to be able to stop, get everybody back together, both persons to actually figure out, hey, we've got to be able to do this. Now, you say, Pam, it sounds like you're pretty excited about this. I am. There's a gentleman on our team that tells a story where this actually was a fatality that occurred in a utility, where there were two people assigned to the job site, and he was working up in the primary zone. The second person was not at the same classification level, but he had the knowledge to be on that job and could do all the things that we're talking about. But because he did not feel empowered, he did not say anything that day. Because he felt that the person that had seniority, that was working up in this primary zone, knew what he was doing and knew that he could handle it. And unfortunately, that particular day, the gentleman lost his life. It was not a good scenario. So I'm saying that second person on that job site has to have power. They have to be able to understand and know that they have to be able to stop the job site whenever it's not in a situation of a safe work practice, because we don't want to get to what most people think the two-person rule is. We want to prevent it from happening with that second person. But now, if something does happen, that second person has to be there to render or provide emergency response. And so they have to be trained in that. They have to be trained in controlling the hazards and providing a quick rescue for that job site. Now, OSHA does talk about this. They talk about being trained in first aid and being trained in rescue procedures, and that's extremely important. They've got to have that training. But well beyond that, because I have clients that have said to me in the past, well, you know, I give the folks that are the second person on that job, they're definitely trained in rescue procedures, but they may not have all the rest of the training. Can they be the second person on the job? I would say no. And OSHA's going to tell us no too in just a little bit when I read some information from OSHA. Control the hazards for themselves and the victim. That's a very clear thing that has to take place. When something happens on a job site, that second person has got to stay mentally alert to be able to calm themselves down enough to be able to control the scene for themselves. Also control the scene for anybody else that's right there at that victim, but control the scene to be able to go in and render this first aid. So there's a lot of knowledge that has to come from the folks that are in this second person scenario. I hope this really drives home with the three major areas that are the purposes, I say areas, the three major purposes of why we have a two-person rule. Now, let's talk about this concept, because in that two-person rule, I want to talk about when it applies. When does the two-person rule apply? We talked about earlier the two-person rule is at least two employees shall be present when. All right, let's look at exactly what the OSHA standards say, and here's what I want to say to you. It's easy just to read these rules and say, oh yeah. I'm going to give you a few examples of what this might look like as we go through to help better get you thinking about it's not so simple as reading the rule. You've got to build the application to make this work. So the first one is you will see that I have two boxes set up here. I have a box there for that two employees whenever they're present, and then I also have something for that minimum approach distance. The minimum approach distance is the main thing we talk about in this two-person rule. The minimum approach distance for reach and extended reach. Now I want to make sure I throw that out there because how you apply MAD is very important. And a lot of times in these two-person rules, I see people really trying to break the MAD rules. But MAD is all about reach and extended reach. And positioning comes into play with MAD. So it's important as you work through your work processes to think about that. Now the first one that we talk about with MAD, if you are installing, removing, or repairing energized lines greater than 600 volts, that one's probably, most folks in our industry do a really good job on having at least two people, most likely more than two people on job sites when that's being done. The second one gets a little more, a little different, because it says if you're going to install, remove, or repair de-energized lines, you've got something that's de-energized, and if an employee is exposed to contact with any parts greater than 600 volts, you've got to have two people there. That one's not so easy. It's not the exact story, but I want to give you a story about that. I had a young man that was in a class that I was teaching several years back, and he walked into my class, and honestly, he only had one arm. He had a hook on his other arm. And me, I wanted to say, well, what happened? But I waited, and finally he came up during lunchtime, and he said, Miss Pam, I know you want to know what happened to me. And I said, absolutely, I want to know what happened to you. And he said, well, I'm going to just tell you, I made a mistake. I said, okay, I mean, we all make mistakes in life. He said, Miss Pam, I made a mistake. He said, I was on a standby, and he said, I'd already been called out one time that night. And he said, I got called out the second time at night. And he said, our company had a rule that I was the primary. I would show up on that job site, and then if I needed help, I would call my secondary, and help means when the two-person rule applies, right? Or it could be more than that, but at least when the two-person rule applies. So if I need help, I would call somebody else. Well, I said, hey, I've got it that night. I get up in the aerial device. He said, I don't know what happened to me. He said, I guess I just went brain dead. He said, what happened was, he said, instead of putting my rubber gloves on that night, he said, I put my work gloves on. And he said, I guess the rest is history. It really brings home the way that your organizations build out these two-person rule requirements. I'm going to tell you, things are tough, and thinking about how you put or pair two people on various job sites are so important. That one is a big one for me. The next one that I want to talk about here is installing, removing, repair of equipment where there are transformers. That's my big one. You guys can see on my list, I've got more than transformers there. But transformers, so I take a serviceman or I take a troubleshooter or whatever you call it in your organization. I have them, one person out there. Then what's going to happen is from time to time they're going to have to replace transformers, they're going to have to replace cutouts, they're going to have to replace certain things that are happening within that area that they are looking at. Now, being able to know when minimum approach distances are going to be approached is going to be an extreme piece of this. So I think that you really have to think through those processes. Now, my next one is work involving the use of mechanical equipment near energized parts greater than 600 volts. And then my last one is other work that exposes an employee to electrical hazards. There could be a lot of things that fall into that category. And I would urge everybody that's thinking about the two-person rule to think through work processes, because there's so many other things in this world other than just being on the list. Now, OSHA does put in to the rules some exceptions for the two-person rule because we're talking about minimum approach distances, we're talking about greater than 600 volts. So what we're going to do is we're going to have these exceptions. The first one is routine switching of circuits. And I would consider routine switching of circuits mostly gang-operated switching, because in the next bullet point, we're going to talk about live line tools. So live line tools, certainly if somebody's using a live line tool, it's going to give you enough distance away from that minimum approach distance that you are not encroaching on minimum approach distance, then the utilization of a live line tool can certainly help. And the last one is emergency repairs to the extent necessary to protect the public. Now, let's get it straight. That is not emergency lights out. And honestly, I still, from time to time, whenever I go over this in an OSHA course of some sorts, I'll still have people say, when I give them an opportunity up front, what does that mean? I still have people say, oh, that could be an emergency, like we've got a lot of lights out. No, that is not an emergency, not in this world. An emergency is people's lives are in danger. You have lines down in the roadway. You have serious things happening. So that is an emergency. And we're only talking about when two people are required on a job site now. So don't get caught up into, I don't have to do all these things to have a safe work place. I do have to have all these things in place. So it is very important that I have all these things in place. Now, what I would like to do is I've got a couple things that I printed off that are interpretations from OSHA. I think that they will help you better understand some of the issues that we have in this industry. So bear with me just a minute and I'm going to go ahead and read these. My first one is a scenario that's talking about a single worker, and I'm going to skip over a few things in here just for time. But a single worker using rubber gloves has changed cutouts and covered primary lines for years at this utility. After reading the applicable OSHA regulations, our company has formed an opinion that a trouble worker working alone using the rubber gloving method cannot perform any primary work on voltages in excess of 700 volts. Not real sure where that came from. The only exception to this rule, in your opinion, would it be for the protection of the public safety, and then the worker could perform only minimum repairs until the proper equipment and crew completion could be obtained? Question is this: in a non-emergency situation, may a single troubleshooter change a cutout using the rubber gloving method when the voltage is in excess of 700 volt. Now, the rubber gloving method most likely is applying line hoses. I mean, it could be more than that, but it would be that, applying line hoses. So the reply from OSHA is no. At least 2 employees must be present while this work is being performed. So I know there are a lot of utilities that look at that, and I just wanted to bring it up. So my next one that I want to talk about is an underground scenario, and there's so much underground going on out there right now. And I know this is happening, okay? An electric utility has recently begun assigning 1 employee to installing, repairing, or removing direct buried secondary services from an underground pad-mounted transformer. The employee digs under the pad, opens the lid to the transformer, and visually inspects the primary cables and elbows for flaws. Following that inspection, the employee then fishes the end of the buried conductor through the transformer pad by reaching in and pulling the cable up through the energized primary or secondary cables. After this is accomplished, the employee must cut, form, and terminate the underground secondary conductors into the secondary terminals. During this time, the employee is working inside minimum approach distance of 12,470, 7,200 volts. And the primary voltage is 12240 volts. The configuration of the existing buried cables is congested, and it is possible to prevent contact with existing energized primary and secondary cables both above and below the ground surface inside the transformer's termination compartment. Furthermore, most existing conductors and elbows could be dislodged or moved during the installation. The integrity of the conductors might be degraded, possibly compromising the ability of the installation to insulate the employee from any other conductive object at a difference of potential. Additionally, the integrity of the concentric neutral and its drain wire connection at the tie-off tab on the elbow can pose a voltage hazard to the employee due to corrosion caused by moisture, solder, or other chemicals. Also, it's possible to affect the drain wire connections at the tie-off. The work positions the employees are at or in front of and above the energized conductors and the transformer's energized bushing terminals. That's a lot of information, but it sets the stage for what the question is. There are 2 employee job classifications that are being used. One is a lineman A job classification. The other one is a service center utility man. The lineman A is a qualified employee under OSHA's standards. The service center utility man classification is an employee who is only trained to work on circuits or equipment rated at 600 volts or lower. Both job classifications have been trained in rescue procedures. In this scenario, this is the question: would an employee working alone from a lineman A classification in an underground pad-mounted transformer energized with the primary voltage as stated earlier, installing or removing, repairing direct buried secondary cables to the pads, be compliant with the 2-person rule? Please note that the employee will not be able to maintain a distance outside the MAD, nor will the employer be able to demonstrate that the energized primary cables and elbows will meet the design specifications for the voltage insulation due to degrading over time. The response is no. The standard specifies the work and requires the presence of at least 2 employees while this work is being performed. That is major in our industry. And this is an OSHA interpretation. One other major thing that I want to make sure before I let you go here is I want to talk through this. The question 2. is in the same scenario as question 1. Is one man working alone, this time an individual classified as a service center utility man, compliant with the requirements of this standard? The response, no. Based on the information you provided, a service center utility man would not constitute a qualified employee, and therefore would be prohibited from working on or with exposed energized lines or parts. These are major, major things. If you are trying to determine what your 2-person rule needs to look like, I would definitely ask you to go back and look at some of the interpretations that OSHA has out. I would always say to you too, please, if you have any questions and I can help you in any way, just please give us a call. But at the end of this, I want to say this. Does your 2-person rule include all the things that you're going to see here on the screen? Are you really highlighting preventing electrocution, monitoring work practices, and providing emergency response? Are you doing those things? Are you reviewing regularly with the employees that the purpose of the 2-person rule and how you apply it, such as monitoring work practices when somebody is up in those live energized parts or working in and around the MAD? And do you have a method in place to assess whether this is working? Because nobody wants to know that something happened when we didn't look at a process. I urge you to look at, if you do have standby, you do have troubleshooters, you do have service people that work alone, are you looking at the intent of this rule and putting things in place? I thank you very much as always, and have a great day.